The morning sun cast a deceptive golden glow over the manicured lawns of Oakwood Preparatory, an elite middle school where the air usually smelled of freshly mown grass and expensive laundry detergent. It was career day, and the parking lot was a parade of luxury SUVs and sleek sedans, driven by parents who held the keys to the city's most powerful institutions. The campus was a sanctuary of privilege, protected by wrought iron fences and the unspoken rule that nothing bad ever happened within these zip codes. However, the serene atmosphere was abruptly pierced by the low, guttural growl of a tactical transport van, a windowless charcoal beast that sat idling near the school's main gate. Its metallic skin looked like a cold, jagged predator lurking in a playground, a jarring intrusion of federal enforcement into a space designed for the safety and innocence of children. Agent Miller sat behind the wheel of the van, his eyes shielded by mirrored sunglasses that reflected the bright, colorful backpacks of passing students as nothing more than distorted streaks of light. At 42, Miller had spent 15 years in the field, and the constant exposure to the darker corners of society had left him with a soul as weathered as his tactical vest. He prided himself on being a hardliner, a man who viewed the world through a binary lens of compliance or threat, leaving no room for the messy nuances of human emotion. To Miller, everyone was a potential suspect, and every hesitation was a tactical opening that could lead to disaster. He had long ago traded his empathy for a cynical brand of efficiency, convincing himself that his aggressive posturing was the only thing standing between order and a chaotic, lawless void. Standing on the curb, just a few yards from the menacing van, was 12-year-old Leo Vance, a sixth grader who looked even smaller than his age in his neatly pressed school blazer. He clutched a violin case to his chest like a shield, his bright, intelligent eyes darting toward the school gates as he waited for his father to pick him up after his solo performance. Leo was a child of melody and mathematics, a boy whose world was defined by the precise placement of fingers on strings and the quiet encouragement of his parents. However, in this affluent, predominantly white suburb, Leo's black skin made him an anomaly to a man like Miller, whose biases were hard-coded into his professional survival instincts. The boy's slight frame and school uniform meant nothing to the agent. He only saw a subject who didn't quite fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The tension escalated when Miller lowered his window, the cold air from the van's interior spilling out like a warning. He called out to Leo, his voice a gravelly bark that sent a visible shiver through the boy's small shoulders. Terrified and confused, Leo began to stutter, his words catching in his throat as he tried to explain that he was simply waiting for his ride home after career day. To Miller, the boy's nervous stammer was a sign of guilt, and his wide eyes were the shifty gaze of a lookout or an undocumented runaway. The agent didn't see the school crest on Leo's blazer. He saw a person of interest who was failing to provide a satisfactory explanation for his presence in such a high-end area. The predator had found its mark, and the logic of the street began to override the reality of the schoolyard. The situation turned violent in a heartbeat when Leo, desperate for safety, reached into his pocket to pull out his phone to call his father. Miller, conditioned to interpret every sudden movement as a reach for a weapon, kicked his door open and lunged at the child with a ferocity that was entirely unearned. He tackled the 12-year-old into the grass, the violin case skidding across the pavement with a sickening crack as the delicate wood inside splintered. Leo's cries of, "I go here," were ignored as Miller pinned him down, his heavy knee pressing into the boy's back while he wrenched his small arms behind him. The metallic click of adult-sized handcuffs snapping shut around Leo's slender wrists was the sound of a childhood being fractured by a man who had forgotten how to be human. With a cold, practiced efficiency, Miller hauled the sobbing boy to his feet and shoved him into the dark, airless back of the transport van. He didn't look at the tears streaming down Leo's face, or the way the boy's school tie was now tattered and stained with dirt. Miller simply slammed the heavy steel doors, plunging the child into total darkness, and climbed back into the driver's seat with a grunt of satisfaction. He believed he had successfully cleared a threat from the streets, oblivious to the fact that he had just committed a kidnapping under the color of law. As the van pulled away from the gates of Oakwood Preparatory, the silence that returned to the school grounds was heavy with the weight of a looming catastrophe that Miller's arrogance could not yet foresee. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The drive to the processing center was a blur of shadows and sharp turns for Leo, who sat huddled on the cold metal floor of the van, the oversized handcuffs weighing his hands down like lead. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through his shoulders, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the overwhelming terror of being trapped in the dark. He tried to remember the breathing exercises his violin teacher taught him for stage fright, but his lungs felt constricted by the thick industrial scent of the van. He kept whispering for his dad, his voice cracking into a silent sob as he realized that for the first time in his life, his parents couldn't see him or protect him. He was no longer a star student or a beloved son. He was a body in transit, a nameless cargo being moved through a system that didn't care about his name. Agent Miller, meanwhile, hummed a tuneless song as he navigated the afternoon traffic, his mind already drifting toward his end-of-shift routine. To him, the boy in the back was just another case number to be processed, a minor detail in a career built on the removal of unwanted elements. He had convinced himself years ago that the law was a blunt instrument and that he was the steady hand required to swing it. Miller's partner, a younger agent who had remained silent during the arrest, looked at the cracked violin case left behind on the sidewalk through the rearview mirror, but he said nothing, fearful of challenging Miller's seniority. The culture of the agency was one of silence and solidarity, a fortress where the ego of the officer was often prioritized over the rights of the citizen. Miller's cynicism was a shield he had forged after a decade of seeing the worst parts of human nature, but it had eventually hardened into a dangerous form of blindness. He had lost the ability to see the difference between a hardened criminal and a frightened child, viewing every interaction as a battle of wills that he was determined to win. He lived in a modest house filled with trophies from his high school football days, a man who clung to the idea of being a protector while actually becoming a source of trauma. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a soldier in a war that most people were too soft to fight. This delusion allowed him to ignore the ethical rot that was slowly consuming his professional integrity, one justified aggression at a time. When they finally arrived at the processing facility, a bleak, windowless structure of concrete and barbed wire, Miller roughly hauled Leo out of the van. The boy's school blazer was torn, and his eyes were bloodshot from crying. But Miller merely grunted and pushed him toward the intake desk. The bright fluorescent lights of the facility made Leo blink in pain, the sterile environment feeling like a cold, hostile planet. The guards and clerks moved with a mechanical indifference, their faces masks of bureaucratic boredom as they prepared to document another unaccompanied minor. No one looked at Leo's face. They only looked at the paperwork Miller was aggressively filling out, his pen scratching against the carbon paper with a sound like a sharpening knife. It was a factory of dehumanization where the individual was stripped away. Empty his pockets, Miller barked at a junior officer, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. As the officer began to pile Leo's meager belongings on the counter, a heavy, velvet-lined box fell out of the boy's inner blazer pocket, along with a high-end GPS-tracked smartwatch that began to beep insistently. Miller picked up the box with a sneer, expecting to find a piece of stolen jewelry or contraband. However, as the lid clicked open, the sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, sinking feeling in his stomach. Resting on the dark velvet was a gold federal judicial seal, a heavy, gleaming medallion that carried the weight of supreme legal authority. It was a gift from Leo's father, a symbol of the high office he held, and a reminder of the justice his family swore to uphold. The silence that followed was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic beeping of the smartwatch on the counter. Miller stared at the seal, his mind racing to find a justification. But for the first time in his career, his good intentions defense felt like paper in a hurricane. He realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the description he claimed Leo matched was a fiction he had created to justify his own prejudice. The boy wasn't a runaway or a lookout. He was the son of a titan. Just as Miller reached out to silence the watch, the heavy double-reinforced steel doors of the processing center were not just opened. They were literally kicked off their hinges. The sound of the impact was like a cannon blast, signaling the arrival of a force that the agency was completely unprepared to handle. Judge Lawrence Vance did not walk into the room. He descended upon it like a force of nature, flanked by a squad of U.S. Marshals with their weapons drawn and a full local news camera crew. He was a man of immense stature, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to radiate power, his face a mask of controlled, righteous fury. He didn't look like a grieving father in that moment. He looked like the embodiment of the law itself, come to collect a debt from those who had perverted it. Behind him, the director of field operations was already on his cell phone, his voice shaking as he realized the magnitude of the catastrophe that Agent Miller had initiated. The predator in the tactical vest suddenly looked very small and very exposed under the judge's burning gaze. The marshals immediately surrounded Miller and his partner, their movements precise and lethal, while Judge Vance strode directly to his son. He didn't say a word as he reached for a pair of bolt cutters from a marshal's kit and personally snapped the handcuffs off Leo's wrists, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and relief. He pulled the boy into a crushing embrace, burying his face in Leo's neck as the boy finally let out a wail of pure, unadulterated release. The camera crew captured every second of the reunion, the bright lights of the lenses illuminating the bruises on Leo's wrists and the tattered remains of his school blazer. This was not a private tragedy. It was a public execution of Miller's career, broadcast in high definition for the entire world to see. Miller tried to step forward, his voice cracking as he attempted to offer a standard explanation about reasonable suspicion and officer safety. But he was silenced by a look from the lead marshal that promised immediate violence. Judge Vance turned toward the agent, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "You didn't see a child," the judge whispered, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You saw a target, you saw a color, and in doing so, you forgot that the law is not yours to wield like a club." He informed Miller right then and there that he wasn't just suing the agency, he was coming for every person in the chain of command who had allowed this culture of aggression to flourish. The fallout began within minutes, as the director of field operations tried to pull the judge aside for a private conversation to mitigate the damage. He spoke of Miller's exemplary record and offered a multi-million-dollar settlement to keep the matter out of the courts, hoping to protect the agency's reputation. But Lawrence Vance laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill through the room. He made it clear that no amount of taxpayer money could buy his silence or his son's dignity back. He wanted a public reckoning, a total dismantling of the systems that allowed an agent to tackle a 12-year-old with a violin case. He was going to use his power to ensure that Career Day would be the last day Miller ever wore a badge or held a weapon. In the days that followed, the story dominated every news cycle. The image of the gold judicial seal sitting on the intake counter, becoming a symbol of the rot within the enforcement agency. Miller was placed on administrative leave, but he knew the end was coming. His partner had already turned on him, providing a full statement about the lack of any actual description for the arrest. The internal affairs investigation was a mere formality, as the public pressure grew to a fever pitch. Miller sat in his house, watching the news as his life's work was picked apart by legal experts and civil rights advocates. He tried to tell himself he was a victim of political correctness, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the terror in Leo's eyes and the way the boy had stuttered. The judge filed a massive civil rights lawsuit, naming not just Miller, but the supervisor who signed off on the transport, the partner who watched, and the director who fostered the environment of impunity. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. The supervisor was fired for gross negligence. The partner was suspended and eventually resigned in disgrace. The director of field operations, once an untouchable figure in the department, was forced into a humiliating early retirement, as the evidence of systemic bias within his ranks became impossible to ignore. It was a scorched earth campaign of legal retribution that left the agency in ruins. But Lawrence Vance was not done yet. He knew that firing a few men wasn't enough. He had to change the law itself to protect the next child. Leo, meanwhile, was struggling with the invisible wounds of the encounter, waking up screaming from nightmares about the dark van and the cold metal on his wrists. He started seeing a specialist for PTSD, his once vibrant interest in the violin replaced by a sudden sharp fear of loud noises and strangers in uniforms. His father watched him with a breaking heart, realizing that while he had destroyed Miller's career, he couldn't simply sue away his son's trauma. This realization fueled the judge's fire even more, turning his quest for justice into a crusade for national reform. He spent his nights drafting legislation between comforting his son, turning his grief into a weapon of structural change. He was no longer just a father or a judge. He was a man on a mission to ensure no other family felt this pain. The internal conflict within Miller began to fester as the reality of his situation set in. Stripped of his badge and the authority he had used as a crutch for 15 years. He attended the preliminary hearings in civilian clothes, feeling small and naked without his tactical gear, forced to listen to the testimony of psychologists who described the lasting damage he had done to a 12-year-old boy. He looked at the bruises on Leo's wrists in the evidence photos, bruises that he had caused, and for the first time, the numbness he had cultivated began to crack. He saw his own face in the news, described as a monster, and he struggled to reconcile that image with the man who thought he was a hero. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made sleep impossible. The external pressure was equally relentless, as protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day carrying signs with Leo's name and pictures of broken violins. The city was on edge, and the political establishment was desperate to distance itself from Miller, who had become a pariah even among his fellow officers. He was a liability, a toxic asset that no one wanted to defend, and he realized that the brotherhood he had relied on was a myth that vanished the moment he became a target. He was alone in a storm of his own making, facing a legal team that had more resources and more passion than any he had ever encountered. The predator was now the prey, hunted by the very system he had once served with such arrogant disregard for the humans caught in its gears. As the trial date approached, the judge refused every plea deal and every settlement offer, making it clear that he wanted Miller to face a jury of his peers. He wanted the world to hear the details of that morning at Oakwood Preparatory, to understand how a career day turned into a kidnapping. He worked tirelessly with his legal team, preparing a case that was not just about one arrest, but about a culture of dehumanization that had been allowed to fester for decades. He was using his son's suffering as a mirror to show the country the ugliness of its own institutions. The tension in the city reached a boiling point, with everyone waiting to see if a badge would truly be enough to shield a man from the consequences of his own cruelty. In the quiet moments at home, Leo started to pick up his violin again, but the music was different now, deeper, more melancholic, a reflection of the innocence he had lost in the back of that van. His father would sit and listen, the sound of the strings a reminder of why they were fighting so hard in the courtroom. They were fighting for the music, for the childhoods that were being silenced by men like Miller, and for the right of every black boy to walk to his father's car without being treated like a criminal. The bond between father and son was forged into something unbreakable, a shared purpose that gave them the strength to face the cameras and the lawyers every day. They were no longer victims. They were the architects of a new kind of accountability. Miller's defense team tried one last desperate tactic, attempting to paint the judge as a vengeful elite who was overreacting to a standard procedure, but the argument fell flat in the face of the evidence. The GPS data from the smartwatch showed the erratic driving of the van, and the audio recording from the processing center captured Miller's aggressive tone and the boy's terrified stuttering. There was no standard procedure that justified the treatment Leo received, and the defense was quickly falling apart under the weight of the truth. Miller sat at the defense table, his head bowed, realizing that his career was not just over. It was being erased, replaced by a legacy of shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. The rebirth of justice was beginning, and it was starting with his total destruction. The night before the final testimony, the judge sat with Leo in the boy's room, looking at the gold judicial seal that had started the whole chain of events. He told Leo that the seal wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a promise that they would always stand up for what was right, no matter how powerful the opponent. He promised his son that tomorrow they would show the world that a child's safety is more important than any badge or any agency. Leo nodded, his hand resting on the violin case that had been meticulously repaired, a symbol of his own healing. They were ready for the climax, ready to face the man who had tried to steal Leo's humanity, and show him that the law finally had teeth again. The courtroom was a cathedral of heavy oak and suffocating expectation as the final day of the trial commenced. Every bench was filled with silent observers, their eyes alternating between the disgraced Agent Miller and the small, dignified figure of Leo Vance. Judge Lawrence Vance did not sit on the bench today. He stood at the prosecutor's table, having waived his judicial immunity to act as a witness and a father. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the electric hum of a dozen news cameras broadcasting the proceedings to a nation held in suspense. Miller sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped and his tactical bravado completely stripped away, looking like a ghost of the man who had patrolled Oakwood Preparatory. The silence in the room was so profound that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown to a definitive, life-altering explosion of truth. When Leo was called to the stand, a collective breath was held throughout the gallery as the 12-year-old walked slowly toward the witness box. He was dressed in a new school blazer, but his hands were trembling slightly as he climbed the steps, his small frame looking vulnerable against the massive, formal backdrop of the court. Judge Vance stood nearby, his gaze offering a silent, ironclad support that seemed to give the boy the strength to speak. For the first few moments, Leo's stutter returned, a jagged reminder of the trauma that still lived beneath his skin. But as he looked at his father, his voice began to find its rhythm. He described the darkness of the van, the cold bite of the metal on his wrists, and the terrifying realization that his school uniform was not enough to protect him from a man with a badge. The climax reached its boiling point when Judge Vance, during his own testimony, refused to accept a final, last-minute multi-million-dollar settlement offered by the government's attorneys. He turned away from the lawyers and walked directly toward Agent Miller, stopping just a few feet from the man who had kidnapped his son. The judge didn't yell. He spoke with a terrifying, quiet clarity that forced everyone in the room to lean in. He demanded that Miller look at Leo, not as a subject, not as a description, but as a human being whose childhood had been scarred by a man's unchecked ego. "Tell my son, Agent Miller," the judge whispered, his voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury, "why a 12-year-old boy carrying a violin case was a threat to the security of the United States of America. Look at the marks on his wrists and tell him why you chose to be the monster." Miller, who had spent the entire trial staring at the floor, slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Leo's for the first time since the processing center. In that moment, the standard procedure defense he had clung to for months finally disintegrated, leaving him naked before his own conscience. He saw the therapy appointments, the nightmares, and the fractured confidence of a gifted child, and the weight of his own cruelty finally broke him. The former agent began to sob, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the courtroom as the reality of his actions finally pierced through his armor of cynicism. He realized that in his quest to keep the streets safe, he had become the very source of the violence he claimed to oppose, destroying a child's peace for a moment of perceived authority. The courtroom became a theater of raw human reckoning as Miller confessed, his words tumbling out in a disorganized heap of regret and admission. He admitted there was no description, no lookout, and no suspicion, only his own bias and the intoxicating high of absolute power over someone who couldn't fight back. He acknowledged that his career was not just a casualty of a lawsuit, but a forfeit for his lack of basic human empathy. The cameras captured every tear and every stuttered apology, stripping away the mystery of the badge to reveal a man who had lost his way in the shadows of his own prejudice. It was a total, public dismantling of the warrior persona he had cultivated, leaving behind only the wreckage of a life built on the dehumanization of others. The judge then turned back to the court, his presence towering over the proceedings as he called for a judgment that went beyond a simple prison sentence. He demanded a structural rebirth, a total overhaul of the laws that allowed children to be treated like contraband in the name of national security. He spoke of the Leo Vance Law, a proposed mandate that would end the era of unchecked minor detention and ensure that no child ever felt the cold steel of handcuffs without a guardian present. His words were a call to arms for every parent and every citizen who believed that a badge should be a symbol of protection, not a license for predation. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It was a sanctuary of justice, where the pain of a child was being forged into a shield for an entire nation. As the jury retired to deliberate, a strange, hopeful peace settled over the room, a sharp contrast to the jagged tension of the morning. Leo walked down from the stand and was immediately caught in his father's arms, the two of them standing in the center of the court as a symbol of resilience and recovery. Even Miller's own defense attorneys looked on with a sense of grim realization, knowing that they had participated in a trial that would redefine the boundaries of police power for a generation. The destruction of Miller's life was not a tragedy. It was a necessary clearing of the ground to build something more humane and more honest. The rebirth of justice was no longer a theory. It was happening in the silence of the deliberation room, and the steady heartbeat of a father holding his son. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The verdict was a thunderous affirmation of human rights, as the jury found Miller guilty of civil rights violations and aggravated assault, sentencing him to the maximum term allowed by law. His pension was forfeited, and his name was permanently barred from any form of law enforcement, ensuring that his career ended in the very same cold, windowless environment he had once forced upon Leo. But the victory went far beyond the punishment of a single man. The Leo Vance Law was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, fundamentally shifting the landscape of American policing. No longer could a minor be detained without the immediate presence of a legal guardian, and mandatory identity verification became the first step in every interaction involving a child. The system that had once functioned as a predator was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt with the protection of the vulnerable as its primary directive, a lasting tribute to the boy with the violin. The physical and emotional landscape of Leo's life began to heal as the shadow of the trial receded into the past. We see Leo standing in the school auditorium, his violin tucked beneath his chin, playing a solo that was no longer a lament, but a triumphant anthem of resilience. The stutter in his speech had faded, replaced by a confident, melodic resonance that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. His father, Lawrence Vance, sat in the front row, having resigned from the federal bench to dedicate his life to leading a national police reform foundation. They had turned their private agony into a public legacy, ensuring that the gold judicial seal was now a symbol of a promise kept to the youth of the country. The Vance home was once again filled with the sounds of practice and laughter, the darkness of the van replaced by the warm, golden light of a future they had fought to secure. The National Police Reform Foundation, founded by Lawrence, became the gold standard for accountability, training thousands of officers in de-escalation and the elimination of racial bias. The foundation's headquarters featured a large mural of a violin intertwined with a gavel, a constant reminder that the arts and the law must both serve the harmony of society. Communities that had once lived in fear of tactical vans now saw officers walking the beats, engaging with children, and learning the names of the families they served. This was the rebirth the judge had envisioned, a shift from a culture of enforcement to a culture of engagement. The Leo Vance Law became a model for international human rights organizations, proving that the courage of one family could ignite a global movement for the protection of childhood innocence. Leo's recovery was not just about the absence of trauma, but the presence of a new, profound purpose that would define his transition into adulthood. He spent his summers volunteering at the foundation, speaking to other young people who had experienced systemic injustice and teaching them that their voices were more powerful than any weapon. He became a symbol of hope for an entire generation of black and brown children who had been taught to fear the uniform, showing them that the law could be a tool for liberation if they had the courage to wield it. His violin became his primary instrument of advocacy, his concerts serving as fundraisers for the legal defense of families who lacked the resources his father had possessed. The boy who was once silenced in the back of a van was now the loudest voice for change in the country. As the years passed, the memory of Agent Miller faded into a cautionary tale told in police academies, a grim reminder of what happens when power is exercised without perspective. The agency he once served underwent a total cultural transformation, with the tough-on-crime rhetoric replaced by a community-first philosophy that prioritized the safety of all residents. The elite suburb of Oakwood Preparatory was no longer a sanctuary of exclusive privilege, but a part of a larger, more inclusive community that recognized the inherent dignity of every child, regardless of their background. The wrought iron fences remained, but the gates were now open, symbolizing a society that no longer felt the need to hide behind barriers of bias and fear. The air at the school still smelled of freshly mown grass, but it now carried the scent of true, unburdened freedom. The moral of this story is that power without perspective is nothing more than a weapon, and true authority is only found in the protection of the smallest among us. No badge, no title, and no government agency is higher than the fundamental human right to safety and dignity, especially for a child. When we allow our biases to blind us to the humanity of others, we don't just betray our profession, we betray our own souls. The story of Leo and Lawrence Vance teaches us that justice is not a static destination, but a continuous journey of accountability and empathy. We must always remember that the strength of a nation is not measured by the force of its enforcement, but by the melody of its children's laughter and the unwavering protection of their dreams. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment, "Love is priceless," if you also believe in human union. 10 years after the gavel first fell in the Vance trial, the morning sun shone brightly over the grounds of a major metropolitan police academy. A young man, tall and poised with a familiar spark of intelligence in his eyes, stood at the head of the graduating class, wearing the uniform of a high-ranking advocate for community-first policing. This was Leo Vance, now 22, holding the same gold judicial seal his father had given him so long ago, its surface still gleaming with the weight of his family's promise. He wasn't there to lead a tactical unit or a raid. He was there to lead a new era of officers who were trained to see the person before the protocol. As he passed through a nearby public park on his way to the ceremony, he paused to watch children of all backgrounds playing together, protected by officers who knew their names and shared in their joy. Leo smiled, knowing that the Leo Vance law was more than just words on a page. It was the heartbeat of a world where every child was safe to walk home with their music.